Welcome. We're very happy to have you here with us for the second webinar in our Enhancing Virtual Early Childhood Services with AEPS webinar series. I'm Amy Klaus, Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Products at Brooks Publishing, and I'm very happy to have Dr. Joanne Johnson joining us today to talk about engaging families with AEPS. So before we get started, I just have a few tips to help you listen to the webinar today. So we recommend you close any applications that may take bandwidth on your computer. And if you have a question, please go ahead and submit it in the webinar panel will be taking those questions at the end. And if you do have any audio issues, just make sure that your speaker selection's on audio, and if you have problems or you lose audio during it, you can just try reconnecting. That sometimes helps. So there will be a survey at the end of the webinar for those of you who are joining us live today. So we'd love to have your feedback, and we encourage you to fill it out. We'll be selecting one person who fills it out to win a free book of their choice. So that survey appears as you close the webinar, and it's also in your follow-up email tomorrow, a link to it. There will be a certificate provided for today's webinar. So for everyone joining us live, there is a certificate uploaded in your handout section, so you can download that and fill it out. There will also be a certificate linked in your follow-up email tomorrow. And for those of you who are watching the recording of this session, we'll share a URL to get that certificate at the end of the webinar. Also, just to let you know, the slide handouts for today's presentation, they're uploaded to the handout section. And I put the link in the chat box if you're watching on a device where you can't download anything. So now I'm happy to introduce Dr. Joanne Johnson. She's an associate professor in the Child and Family Studies Department in the School of Education at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota. Since the 1990s, Dr. Johnson has worked with both federal and numerous state departments of education and provided workshop and training throughout the US and internationally on the use of AEPS and activity-based interventions for families and professionals. So we're really happy to have you here with us, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I guess if Amy can hear me, everybody else can hear me.
Yes.
I am very happy to be here today, and I'm really happy to be doing this presentation. I have, in the years that I was providing services, I worked with a lot of families, and I have really great memories of all the work that we did together. So I'm just going to go through the objectives for this webinar, and we'll cover all of this. There's some very detailed strategies that I'm going to share with you when we get to the AEPS components, but I did want to say some things about working with families and stuff like that. So it's really important to consider the unique situation of all the families and their efforts to cope with the pandemic. I think it's been a really kind of stressful, difficult place for all of us to be in. So I think it's just really important that we always consider that every family has a really unique situation. The next objective that we're going to work on is how to use the AEPS and all of the components to really promote and encourage family engagement in this virtual world. And Amy and I were talking, I think it was late last week or early this week, and said that about 80% of the people who attend these are doing virtual services, intervention, and assessment with the families that they work with and the children that they work with. So we are all learning a lot about the virtual world. We're also going to discuss some strategies to support families in the virtual assessment and service delivery. And then we're going to talk about learning how to use the fillable family report with families. Oops, I got to get down here again. Sorry. Okay, so when I started preparing for this webinar, I kind of went through like this whole rehashing of what it was like when in March when all this stuff happened. And so I just put these bullets in here to just, and I'm sure everybody else was going through the same thing. Work in our typical environment really ground to a halt in March of 2020. And for me and a lot of the early interventionists or early childhood special educators that I am associated with, we were all told that we should not go back to our workplace. So my campus was closed, all of the schools were closed, and everybody was told that they had to stay home, they couldn't come in, they could not go out to work. So that was a really big change, and for a lot of us, we are still experiencing that. So for me, it took a few weeks to kind of reorganize and figure out how to provide services and consultation for the rest of the school year in a way that few of us had done before. And I pretty much had a very similar situation to any of you that are engaged in assessment and service delivery, because I was teaching classes that we had been doing a lot of face-to-face teaching with. And so it was really critical for me to figure out how to continue that when we got started again. So we restarted about 2 weeks later, and for me, I was totally stressed out. I felt like I was a beginner accessing technology that I was required to use. I had used it before, but not like this. And I was spending hours getting ready for the same things that I'd been doing face-to-face for years, but now it was virtual. And so a lot of you can probably identify with that. Like sharing a screen with some of my students, I had to be really careful about like the things that I wanted them to be able to see that were on my screen. I tried to send them some things in advance so that they always had copies. And so it was just, I always felt like I was just kind of breathless as I sat down, just wondering, do I have everything here? So I think everybody needs to kind of congratulate themselves that they've made it this far during this pandemic. So we're going to talk about promoting engagement with families. And so I have like about 7 or 8 just kind of really important tips that I really encourage everybody to think about. And I have to do this with my students, and it really helps when I use all of these. So the first thing is to maintain regular contact with families so that they know that you're there for them. Because for a lot of us, it's kind of like everything just kind of shut off when the pandemic hit and we had to close everything. So maintaining regular contact with families is really important. Also, when you talk with them and you start a conversation, ask them how things are going. And I would recommend starting general and then going to more specific kinds of things, and really give families an opportunity to open up. So when Amy and Monica and I greeted each other today, Monica said, "How are you?" And I was like, "We don't have 20 minutes to talk about this." So I said, "I'm fine." But you know, the longer you talk with somebody, the more opportunity it gives them to kind of mention some things that they might not have mentioned if you didn't give them that space to open up. Then the other thing that I think is really important is to record the meeting that you're having, or else take very good notes, and be sure to let the families know that you're recording. And then also, it's really important to tell them how doing that might help. And all of you have probably, if you've, well, either in the classroom or as a home visitor, you probably remember, like after a visit, that you maybe have driven like, you know, a mile away or something, and you parked the car and you wrote down all the notes that you wanted to be sure to remember, so that you weren't like starting over again the next time. And if you have a class, you probably walk by your desk 20 times a day and you write down some little notes to yourself. So be sure that the families know that that kind of information is really important, because you really want to keep track of it. And then do some follow-up on like the time or as needed, for them to be able to talk about some things that maybe they tried or you suggested or something like that. Some other pointers for this is sometimes it really helps to plan ahead and categorize the agenda so that you're organized and you can communicate things, and there isn't something that you wanted to be sure to mention, but if it wasn't written down, you might forget it. And then I just put this little plan together of like, these are the things that you could organize into. So like, what have you done this week with your child that you feel like it was successful? Or do you want to talk about some successes that you guys have been having? And then that really logically moves into progress and how they're doing with some of their skills that they're working on. The next thing that I would strongly encourage is to, if you've been getting really great feedback from parents about their success and the child's progress, it might be a really good time to talk about identifying some new target skills, because we want the child to not practice skills over and over that they already have acquired and are using very functionally, but we would like to move on to something to help them acquire additional skills. And then move into some concerns that families might have and some issues that they may have. And I don't really want to suggest like what a concern might be, because all of you are working with families who have very real and very individual concerns and issues. And so I would just tell you to address those on an individual, family to family way of addressing those. Then clarify what you hear. And if you hear something and you might immediately have like a mental reaction to it, and maybe you say to yourself, did I hear that right? It's really important to clarify what you hear, to ask if you understood it correctly. And I'll just tell you, I am working with a graduate student who sends me emails, and her emails are very difficult to understand, like what she's actually talking about. And so a lot of times I'll reply back to her and say, when you wrote this, were you talking about this? Because I want to make sure that I'm understanding what they are asking about or what they're telling me. Then prioritize what you want to work on next, and be sure to focus on family needs that are going to help the family and help that child. And then confirm your next virtual meeting if that's how you're doing it. And I would also suggest that you verify that the logistics are working for you and the family. And I know that in my state, both birth to 3 and 3 to 6 are part of our education division. And in other states, it might be health department or rehabilitation department or something like that. And so the reason that I mention this is every area or department that is associated with providing services and assessments to young children, they probably have purchased some platform that you will conduct your visits on. So I do a lot of things on Zoom. Some of you will be using Google Meetings. This one that we're using is GoToMeeting, and we'll talk a little bit about Seesaw when we get further along in the presentation. So it's really important to figure out like the best way that is going to work for families. Okay. I also wanted to present to you the DEC recommendations for a highly effective workforce for family engagement. And it's really important to think about that. This just came out in June 2020, and there's 7 points here, and they recommend forming reliable alliances with families. These kinds of alliances are proven to move much closer to achieving outcomes, desirable outcomes that we want. Also include families in decision making, inform each other. And that's really important, that informing each other, so that if decisions are made, it's communicated to the team. The families are very aware of it. The service coordinator or family services coordinator is is contacting and they know what the decision was. Then treat each other with dignity and respect and build that foundation for collaboration. Also, engage in intentional and continual dialogue. And this is meant to think about, like, what is the purpose of the meeting that we're having, whether it's email, texting, or a Zoom. We want to make sure that we have our ideas in order of what we're going to talk about, and so that we have a purpose for that. The continual dialogue doesn't mean that we're going to talk to them every single day or anything like that, but that it's routine and it's regular and it is a dialogue. Then nurture the partnership to become intact, strong, equal, and deliberate decision making. And I say that for each day, each conversation, and in this new virtual norm. Finally, use strategies that engage families in both assessment and intervention. And as we go through this presentation, you'll see that families have so much information that they can provide to us that will help us help them. Okay, so this slide is, it's basically for professionals to look at and see it and think about, like, oh yeah, the AEPS is a linked system. And this slide is really to kind of give you a visual of how that conversation and that dialogue that we have with families helps to tell us if adjustments are necessary. So I just want to direct your attention over to the far right box that says progress monitoring. And I want you to notice that that particular box is connected to every other box in this whole linked system process. So our progress monitoring can help us make adjustments to every other link in the system. It might change it might change a priority to address that we're watching and listening and talking with families, and we're thinking, wow, maybe that priority should be changed a little bit. And remember, AEPS is a very flexible system. It's a programmatic assessment, so it's there's ways that there's flexibility in it for you to make some changes. Then it might affect, like, when, where, or how we provide practice opportunities for a child to work on skills. And in our conversations with parents, we might hear them say that a particular skill that they were practicing right after dinner time, it's like, that has not been a really good time. And so you can strategize and plan with families about maybe there's a better time for them to practice this skill. And you can think about that, like, multiple times a day, or reducing it down to maybe 2 times a day to practice, but giving them enough opportunities so that they are able to make some progress on it. Then our progress monitoring also affects the next time we do reassessment. And because we know, like, from the first several months how the child has progressed. And so that reassessment time, that I'm not sure when each of you do this, but it could be every 4 months, it could be every 6 months. That progress monitoring information that we have will really support our next time assessment. Also, we can check through and, you know, just figure out what kind of changes have occurred. So we can put in a new skill for them to work on. There's just all kinds of changes that progress monitoring box can go back to and help us make changes that are going to help the child and the family. Okay, so I really wanted to talk about materials today, because everything that we're doing now has really kind of moved to a virtual environment. And if you had lots of materials that were in your classroom, or if you were the kind of service provider who always took some materials out with you, materials can, you know, lack of them anymore might be something that you can get concerned about. So we really believe that materials aren't a barrier to virtual AEPS administration. If you're very familiar with the AEPS, you already know that we have never had specific materials that were required to use the AEPS. And instead, and we very much follow the objectives of authentic assessment. So instead, we use materials that the child is more familiar with at home or in the classroom, so that they are familiar with those things and they use the skills that they have. So the question of like, why do we not have materials? We know that children are more comfortable using familiar materials from their familiar environment, and they're always going to demonstrate their most sophisticated skills with these materials that they have. So that's really important. Another thing is to be sure to discuss materials options with families. So it is kind of nice to know what things families have in their environment that they live in. When so where I live, we've had like a really large increase in our population of people who used to live in Somalia, and there were concerns because so many of them had moved here and they basically had no toys. And I was so encouraged because they were always so interested in saying, what should I get? What should I get? And so we would tell them, you know, go to yard sales and you can find a lot of materials that you might give your child to play with, or there are lots of kind of homemade things that you can use too. So find out what's available in the home, ask what materials are most engaging for the child, and then get creative and identify some options. And so we kind of pooled our heads together here and we came up with some ideas of some creative options. And actually, I really like this first one a lot. Just taking like recycled or scrapped paper and balling it up in a ball instead of using like a rubber ball or a harder ball or something like that. And I really like that idea because it's actually less dangerous for a child to be hit in the head with a rolled up ball of paper than some other kind of ball. And it's really nice for them because it doesn't weigh that much and they can throw it and roll it and kick it, and you can even try catching with them. Another tried and successful material is any kind of materials that you can stack. And I think we're also used to that whole idea of like stacking blocks. That was the thing that a child had to do to demonstrate that they could stack. But we like to think of things more functionally and being able to generalize. And so I like to think of all kinds of things that can be stacked. So plates can be stacked, plastic plates, toy tea sets, paper plates, any of those things. Books can be stacked, and a lot of families have books that they read to their children on a daily basis, so they can stack books. I also know a lot of families still have DVDs, and DVDs come in cases that can be stacked. And so there are so many opportunities for that. If nothing else, pots and pans can be stacked because a lot of times they fit into each other too. I was going to make a note about this that, I've even suggested, you know, if your child is into that big helping mode, that it would be a really good idea for them to think about like stacking laundry, because we all stack laundry. So think about something that the child is interested in and use it as an alternative to the typical block materials. Then instead of beads, use pasta. There's rigatoni, and I don't know that I would go with macaroni because the holes are pretty small. But then you can also use yarn to thread it. And what I like about this idea is that you can display it so that the child sees that I did that. That was what I did. And it gives them a sense of accomplishment. The last one is just using some felt and putting together a felt board and then some story cutouts. And depending on the level of the child that you're working with, if they can use a scissor, they could cut things out. Otherwise, somebody could cut some things out from like a magazine or something, and those could be the things that they would use on a felt board to tell a story. So materials don't have to be expensive, and they don't have to be something that says Fisher Price or any of those other name brands on them. There are lots of things that we can do in the house that have lots of those opportunities, that provide lots of opportunities for our kiddos. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about are the AEPS components, and there are several of them, and we'll talk about each of them. They'll each get their time because the AEPS is so versatile and so flexible that I'm going to sort of talk about things outside of the box of each of those. So we'll talk about the child observation data recording form, and which we all call the CODRF. And we use that typically for for assessing functional skills using clear criteria. We'll also talk about the family report that helps us gather key family insights and gets their input on skills. We'll talk about assessment activities that are going to help us efficiently observe a range of skills. And we'll talk about the child progress record, how it provides a really nice visual record of a child's progress. We'll also talk about the curriculum in level 1 and level 2 and how to match our intervention to those identified target skills. We're also going to spend some time talking about the AEPSi, because almost anything that I already mentioned in the AEPS components, the AEPSi covers that really efficiently and very automatically. And so we all know that the AEPSi does do automated scoring and reporting. And we'll talk a little bit today about how I like to say the AEPSi can slice and dice for you. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then also, I just want to remind you all to read more in Volume 1, Chapter 5 on AEPS and family participation. Again, I just want to say that the components have multiple uses. They're very flexible, lots of versatility, and they can really help you with the families. And I will also say some of these things that say assessment on them can be used long after that official assessment, when intervention and consultation are taking place. So in the next slides, we're going to discuss some possible uses of all of the components. The first one is the CODRF, Child Observation Data Recording Form. We've been starting to use some other acronyms with this. And this is typically the first thing that you as a professional would use, with the exception of maybe the family report. And I've worked with lots of people who count on getting family report information so that they can feel more comfortable and confident about completing the CODRF. The CODRF, which is the test and assessment in a nutshell, has 2 developmental levels. Level 1 is birth to 3, and level 2 is 3 to 6. It also has 6 developmental areas, which are fine motor, gross motor, adaptive, cognitive, social communication, and social. And as you'll see, items are scored with a numeric system. So a 2 equals mastery, a 1 equals inconsistent or sometimes performance, and a 0 equals not yet. The test also identifies, this is really important, the skills that the child has. And I just can't tell you how many times I've heard people planning for the skills that the child needs without a full recognition of what are the skills that the child has. And so the AEPS helps us first identify what are the skills the child has, and then it helps us identify skills that the child needs next. And if most of you have been using this, you probably understand how that can be so effective to helping you identify what we want the child to work on next. The team can work together to use the complete assessment, and I think that is fine. I think families have a lot of information that they can contribute to this. And the other thing that I wanted to say about it is that this is kind of the form, whether it's electronic or whether it's a paper form, that this is the one that families get to see where all of the information is compiled. So it's kind of like how we know the extent of their child's skills, how we help to determine next skills, and then how we periodically can reassess as the child masters skills and target new ones for practice. So it can be really, really helpful. And the next bullet says combining observations with the family report folded in, and that R that is identified in the training and at the top of the Codrf can really help us collect other information from families that we might not see. Then the Codrf can also tell us what items we really would like to observe this next time. So say we conducted an assessment, but we didn't figure out like where they are on that skill. And so the Codrf can really help us if we just draw a little pencil circle around it, or we leave it blank and everything else is filled in. It really helps us think about what we want to observe the next time. So that's the test. And the only other thing that I wanted to add about the test is the Codrf comes, if you look in volume 1 in the appendix, you can see all 6 developmental areas of the assessment, but it's only the skills. There are other ways that you can look at the Codrf that also provides information on the criteria that we use to make a decision about whether a child has a skill. And so you can look for the criterion on the CD-ROM. I believe there was there's another version of it, but the AEPSi, you can click on every single assessment item and it will list the criteria. So you can print all of this information out and everybody can see the criteria, or if there's only a few items that you want to see criteria, that's the way that you can look at it. So the AEPSi is just makes it incredibly easy to collect that information. Okay, the next component of the AEPS that I want to talk about is the family report. And it has so much information that we can gather from that to help us learn more about the child and the family. So the AEPS family report has a level 1 for birth to 3 and a level 2 for 3 to 6. And they are comprised of many of the same skills that we might be asking parents to tell us about as each level of the test that they are partnered with. The family report is available in English and Spanish. It's also available on the CD-ROM or in the AEPSi. There's also copies of it in the appendices of volume 1. And it's also, we'll talk about this in a little bit more, it's also available as a fillable PDF to support use during the virtual service delivery. And the key thing about the family report is that the family provides information based on the child's participation and use of skills and behaviors at home. And so if you're using the family report, you know that we have a new option to support that. If you're not using the family report, I would just encourage you to take a good long look at it to see if there's some things that it could help you with in your position. The other thing I want to talk about is that it's not really just for use during initial assessment. I like to encourage families to talk through some of these things if things have changed in their lives. So a pandemic is a really good example of a big change, and you can use parts of that in any meeting. I also think that working with families where you both are looking at the family report is a really good use of meeting time. So don't discount that it should be something that doesn't take place in the meeting that you have with them, because I think you still learn a lot more about the family and the child by walking through that and occasionally going back to it. So this is section 1 of the family report, and it really helps families describe their child's participation in daily family and community activities. And this example is just of an eating activity that they have, where we'd like to know where, when, and with whom does your child eat their meals. And we really want to know what kinds of foods their child eats, because if we're thinking of some skills that we want them to learn and providing them some practice opportunities, that kind of information might be really important. There's also 2 more questions that we ask them, and you can see number 3 that asks, meals are usually enjoyable because, and we love to have families tell us about why that particular time of day is enjoyable. But then the next question, and it was just cut off on this, is meals can be difficult because, and that's really important too, because that might be an area of the child's development that we really want to help them work on some skills that will make mealtime more reinforcing, or we all feel better about it as a result of the child's developing new skills. The next part of the family report is section 2. And this section helps families report on actions and skills that the child does regularly. So in scoring the section 2 on the family report, we use a Y for yes, the child does the skill, an S for sometimes the child does the skill, and an N for no if the child does not do the skill. And I will just mention that in this part of the family report, we look at goals only. We don't have every single item in a developmental area. And then at the end of each area in section 2, we asked families to indicate skills or actions or behaviors that would be important for the child to learn next. And so we collect that information. I also want to reinforce that it is families' choice about whether they want to complete that, whether they want to complete section 1, whether they want to complete section 2, or if they want to do both of them. And I will tell you a really short story. When I lived and worked in New Orleans, I had like the most wonderful families, and I was trying out section 1 of the family report. And so I handed it to Barb, and I said, Barb had a 3-year-old child that was in our program, and I handed it to her, and I said, would you mind filling this out? And I really want to know, like, if you find this useful, if it helps you describe your child. And I said, you know, I'll send it home with you today. You can take about a week to work on it, and then bring it back and just let me know if that was helpful to you. And so she took it home on a Friday. She brought it back on a Monday and handed it to me. And both sides of every page were filled with her descriptions of answering the questions in section 1. And I almost started crying when I read it, because the family just adored this child, and they thought that they were chosen for him, and they weren't of any particular religion. They just thought it was just such a great fit that this child was in their family. And she just loved talking about all the things that he did. And I realized families really like to talk about how things go in their family life when we're not around, when we can't see it or be there. And it's not always a beautiful description, but it really helps us figure out ways that we can work with them and help things out. Okay, so Amy might have mentioned this, that the family report special release is going to be available, and I know she was posting it in the chat box. It's a fillable, excuse me, a fillable family report, like special release during the COVID. And there are PDFs for level 1 and level 2 in English and Spanish. And right now it's available until the end of this year, December 31st. And you can just complete the form and download it in the Brooks Download Hub. And that's the address there, but it's in the chat box too. Amy, anything you want to add on that?
No, that sounds great, JJ. I'm going to go ahead and put the I'll put the URL in the chat box now for everyone.
Okay, thanks. Okay, the next component of the AEPS that I would like to talk about are the assessment activities. And the assessment activities really were developed, created to help people conduct their assessment of young children. And they were intended for use in the classroom, they were intended for use at home, and they were really nice because they were routines or activities that had a beginning and an end to them. And so they could participate, and there was kind of like a direction that the activity took. And so we had fun doing that, and then we realized how significant these could be in helping anybody collect assessment information on young children. And so we have several of them that are in the textbook, and we have several of them that are in AEPSi. And I'll tell you more about those, and then I'll tell you like how to find and how many there are. So the assessment activities really contribute to two outcomes. First of all, they help us obtain an accurate picture of a child's functional repertoire. So what are the child's skills and how are they using them? And that's really important because sometimes we'll see that a child is using a skill in one particular thing, but they haven't generalized it out into the rest of the things that they do. It's also, the second outcome is observing sets of skills within an activity that are often being functionally used. And so we'll see skills kind of paired together because there's a necessity in that activity to use those. The assessment activities are really can also be like so useful for intervention activities. And if you've used them and you've already seen the skills that are identified in there, you will also realize that those skills, if they are targeted skills for your child, will provide them with more practice on them. They're also very flexible and adaptive. So you can insert other skills that you would like them to see and just think about how you would introduce the need for that skill. Additional materials can be used, and it can help you kind of focus on some targeted skill practice. There are, I wanted to say many different sets available. There are many assessment activities, and they are available in print and in the AEPSi. So they are typically generic enough so that you can kind of support different themes, materials, and locations. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about this is that, first of all, you can use it with several children, but that probably is not anything that you're doing now. But if you have a team of like 4 people that are working with a family, or that the family is part of, and their child, so maybe you have a physical therapist that's part of the team, or an SLP that's part of the team, any of those related services, if you have a team meeting and the family is just letting you see what the child is doing, and they go through an assessment activity, this can really help every single person on that team kind of put together like, how's the child using those skills. So the usefulness for entire teams to use them is also really helpful. So here's some kind of ideas about how to use the assessment activities. And I will just say this, Eva Horn is a professor at Kansas, and she wrote a review of the AEPS, and she said she really liked the AEPS because the assessment activities were like a basic recipe. And depending on, what you wanted or needed to do, you could change some of the ingredients of it. You could change like how you put it together. There's just so many ways that you can change it. And when we think about assessment activities, we think about new materials, changing locations, changing the time of the day that we do it, or the steps that we need to provide, more practice opportunities for them. So here's 3 ideas of how to do this. And then I have something that I want to talk about that's really important associated with us being a service provider. So the first one is just select an assessment activity with parents and get information from them about what to use with their child to practice some particular skills, help them identify some materials that they think might, engage their child, and then together think about what the steps would be. Because for some activities, you want to introduce it, but then after that introduction, it moves into something else. So you may want to develop some steps in them. And then I would encourage you to figure out ways for them to record it, like on Zoom, or to record it somewhere else and then send you a recording or something like that, so that you can see what happens in that activity. And you and the family can brainstorm multiple times if the child doesn't like that activity, or if they like it. Can you provide different ways for them to continue to engage in it, or can you change it so that they might be more interested? The next one is plan a new assessment activities with parents based on the family routine or the activity and their target skills, and use it during the week, substituting all these things that I talked about already: different times, locations, participants, materials, and then ask parents how things went. I think a lot of times we kind of forget about siblings who might be really interested in joining us and might be really interested in seeing what's going on with their siblings. So encourage the parents to consider the rest of the family as we think about these. The last one then is to ask families to prepare a snack time. And you'll see I have a list of things with, first of all, a drink, then finger foods, then spooned food, then hand food, and implement that during like a Zoom call, or for them to record it so that we can see like what are the skills that that child currently uses in a snack or a mealtime activity. And are they using a sippy cup, or do they just have a glass that doesn't have a top on it anymore? And what kinds of finger foods are they using? Okay, so the last thing about assessment activities, and this is really kind of more about like any virtual visit that we would make, where we may have been a home visitor before, or we had that child in our classroom. So as a home visitor, I was always very aware of the fact that if I came once a week, I was still like a new stranger to them. I was still the stranger in the room. And several people have written about this, that for every young child who is 6 to 12 months old, they are very aware of people that they're not familiar with. And so I was thinking about, wow, this virtual intervention and assessment and consultation might be really great, because you'll see the child behaving as they typically would when you or me, the stranger who would come in, kind of prevents them or inhibits them from showing us everything that they know. So you might really see like some different skills or behaviors from a child that you never saw before, because they were so busy staring at you and they couldn't do something. So I just want to remind you that there might be a really nice benefit to being virtual. So here's like the assessment activities that are in volume 2, and they're in Appendix A, and there's 12 activities here. And these were the first ones that we came up with. And you'll see that these look a little bit different than the ones on AEPSi, but really it's kind of the same format, where the activity has a name, and we identify like what age level or developmental level there we're practicing skills at, and then we identify like potential assessment areas. And we can list a whole bunch of different materials that they have. And then the one in the book is a little bit different because we have step 1, and then we think about collecting some information there. It's just more detail oriented because we could type all this in. And the activity that we're looking at here is snack. And so if you looked in Appendix A at this activity, you would probably see that it took 2 or 3 more pages just to talk about like what we're going to be looking at when we get to this next step. And so level 1 and level 2, we have those 12 activities. There's 7 in level 1 and 5 in level 2. For AEPSi, we actually have 3 sets of assessment activities, and they're different for the different settings. So for level 1, we have 7 routines-based assessment activities and 8 center-based assessment activities. And we all know kids that are between 6 months and 3 years old who attend childcare. They may go to early Head Start. They may go 2 days a week to someplace while one of their family members is able to work or something like that. And that might not be the case now, although I know in my community, we have like 3 or 4 locations that are, they provide childcare for essential workers. And we just opened up our campus-based childcare center, and we have almost all of the slots for the children in there are filled. The next level then is level 2, and in that one we have 8 center-based assessment activities. So here's another thing for you guys to look forward to. You can get a sample of the AEPSi assessment activities with 3 fillable versions that are available to webinar participants. So in the level 1, you'll get feeding and meals, routine, and at center base you'll get story time, and at level 2 you'll get story time in the center based. And Amy is putting that link on the chat box too.
Yes, and they're also uploaded in your handout section, those 3 fillable samples, so you can download them now if you want.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So this is an example of AEPSi assessment activity for a center-based activity that is called Story Time, and it's level 1. And there's a description here. You can see that on the slide, and you can see the suggested materials and procedures. And as a professional, you probably can look at this and go, okay, how are we going to like introduce this or move from one part of the activity to the next one? And so just think about that and how you can look at skills from all developmental areas that can be used and assessed within one activity. And if you go through all of the assessment activities using AEPSi for either level 1 or level 2, you should be able to collect all of your assessment information that would then be automatically transferred onto your Codrf. And that is very slick. That's one of the slicey dicey things that the AEPSi does. So that's the really nice thing about it, is that within an activity, they are having opportunities to practice skills from every developmental area, if possible. And so we've tried to think about all of those to just kind of configure how we might be able to collect all that information just by having them engage in those activities. Okay, so the next component that we're going to talk about, oh, here's that special release. Did I talk about this already, Amy?
So these are more, so the 3 samples that we've provided in the handout section and on that URL, we want to let you know that we're going to make all of the AEPSi assessment activities available for all users of AEPS because of the pandemic, just to help you work with families. during this time, and so they'll be available for the entire school year. They're not going to be ready until late September, so the best thing to do is if you're not on the AEPS newsletter, just go ahead and sign up for the newsletter, and we'll be sending an email out as soon as those assessment activities are all available to download.
Thank you so much. Okay, so the next component that we're going to talk about then is the child progress record. And we'll look at a couple samples of that. But I just want to say the child progress record, if you haven't looked at it before, and it's in both the volume 1 and one of the appendices, and it's available in AEPSi, and it fills it out for you. These are really great visuals to share with the families. The display of the skills is very easy to understand. The child's current abilities, targeted skills that they might be working on, and then it also shows the progress so that families can track it as well as us. And as is everything else, it's organized by the 6 developmental areas of the AEPS and includes strands, goals, and objectives. And a really easy way to describe it is that the objectives are illustrated with arrows, and they move from left to right, from easiest to more difficult, and they culminate in reaching kind of an oval box or a curvy box that represents the goals. And so I'll show you a sample of that in a second. I just want to make sure that, rather than describe like shading things in, it's much easier to just show you an example of it. So this one has the skills that the child has mastered shaded in, and the skills that the child has not yet mastered or does not yet perform are left blank. So the goals and the objectives shaded represent the child's mastery, and we think parents really like seeing this, or caregivers, families, because it provides this really nice visual illustration of the child's skills as they move forward toward a skill goal. And I think the visual really helps a lot. Here's an example from the AEPSi, and this one, the AEPSi completes for us. And if you just look at this, anything that is on my screen, it's lavender or purple. So if the whole arrow is lavender or purple, that means the child has mastered the skill. If the arrow has half lavender and half of it not filled in, that means that is an emerging skill. It's a sometimes skill or an inconsistent skill. And so this is a really nice visual representation of that shows how helpful it is to just see how those arrows move across the page towards that ultimate goal. Okay, so now we're going to move into the curriculum, and I love the curriculum. I'll tell you some of the nutshell pieces of it, and then I'll tell you some other things about it. So it represents both the developmental levels, level 1 and level 2 of the AEPS assessment or test, and it also has those same 6 developmental areas that we already talked about. What I really like about the curriculum is that there is a one-to-one correspondence with the AEPS test items. So it's the same order and really easy to link it. And I'll just tell you this, and I have been doing training for a number of years, and almost every training site that I've worked at, they almost always buy at least 3 volumes or all 4 volumes, so that everybody has the administration guide, the test, and then 1 or 2 curriculum. And what I have found is that the curriculum is the least used and maybe the most informative part of the AEPS. And I just know a lot of people don't even open it. But I just want to tell you some of the parts of it that can be so helpful, particularly now when we're thinking about we're not getting to be closer to the people that we work with. And So we have to talk about some things, provide strategies and suggestions for them virtually. So I will also tell you that in all of the training that I've done, I do occasionally get somebody emails me and says, I have some questions about this. And the group that I can remember most vividly was this group in New York City who sent me like a list of 8 questions. And this is not a joke. Every single one of their questions, I could refer them to specific areas of the curriculum that answered all of them. And so I just think the curriculum is so empowering because it just gives you all this information that you can just stick it in your pocket and pull it out when you need it to help families. So I'm going to give you a couple of different things that are in the curriculum. The first one is that it talks about the importance of skills. Have you ever been asked by somebody, why is this skill important? Well, if you are, we have the importance of skills because we think it's really important that people understand, like, how does this particular skill work itself into total skill development? What does that skill lead to? Or how can they be a more fully functioning individual? Also, has anybody ever asked, aren't there some other skills that they could work on when they're working on this skill? And so we have a concurrent skills area within every single goal of the AEPS. And so you'll see, I'll show you an example of that in a little bit too. Another question that we get is, how can I give my child practice opportunities? And you can give your child practice opportunities using the daily routines, using the intervention activities that you can identify and discuss some of those options with families so that you kind of have an idea box here that you can ask families about. And again, I would say don't overwhelm them. Listen to the things that they're most interested and concerned about, and then think about, is there something in the curriculum that might help them? Another question or another way that we can think about this is the environmental arrangements. And some of you have probably had the same experience where you've always had this room situated the way that it is. The chairs have been here, the table is there, whatever it is that room is. And then sometime you just say, I really want to rearrange this because I would rather be able to look out my window or something. And a lot of times what we find is that that change in the environment changes everything. And so I encourage you to think about the families that you work with and how some maybe tiny change or some slight or medium or moderate change might really provide some encouragement for a child to acquire some new skills. And I can think about like a step stool or something like that, or child-sized table and chairs, putting them out where the rest of the family congregates or something like that might really have a change in that child's use of skills. And then, daily routines and intervention activities. And volumes 3 and 4 are going to give you lots and lots of ideas for how to use planned and spontaneous activities, how to change the environment, also how to use a sequence to lead up to a practice opportunity, incorporating practice into daily routines, and then there's that entire section of intervention activities. So here's a slide with, this is an example of a adaptive skill in strand A of adaptive, and it's just talking about concurrent goals and objectives, where the goal is uses tongue and lips to take in and swallow solid foods and liquids. But these are some other skills that the child could also be working at the same time because it's an eating thing. So think about that and check out the curriculum and see where those concurrent goals and objectives are that you might be able to fold into their practicing skills. So the AEPS curriculum provides lots of information in volume 3 for birth to 3 children, in volume 4 for 3 to 6-year-olds, and the AEPSi just has this super cool curriculum reference guide. And it's really nice because as you're using your mouse over the skills, you will also get a little like a little button that says curriculum reference guide. So you can click on that and it will give you all of that core information that I just described. And it's really easy to find it. And there is like a direct link from a test item to the related context. And this is just the reference guide that's on the right side of the slide here. And I think it's a really cool little illustration. What else did I want to talk about with this? I think I've covered the curriculum. Okay, so curriculum suggestions. This is just an example of gross motor strand A, goal 3, creeps forward using alternating arm and leg movements. And these are just some ideas that I've taken out of the curriculum. So playing games, imitating family pets by assuming an all fours position, getting on the floor with the child, which I always recommend, who is in a hands and knees position, then rocking back and forth, encouraging the child to do the same. And you know, when you see a child that's starting to getting ready to get in the creeping position, we see them rocking back and forth because they're trying to figure out which one of my limbs can I pick up without falling over. And then there's one, if the child indicates a desire to get down when they're being held, then strategically placing them in a creeping position where they're facing some really interesting objects or toys, or something that just engages their interest. Also, there's rolling balls and toys on wheels, or cylindrical objects between their arms, so while they're lying on their stomach, they might momentarily rise up to obtain the object. Mirror games are always really fun for the child, and so it encourages them to crawl for a closer look. And I know you can buy like these plastic long mirrors that you can just flip over on the side and put that out occasionally to help the child engage and keep moving. Then lying on the floor to the side of the child, encourage the child with your voice and toys to pivot toward you. And that is a lot of times very enticing, but this is one of those things that if you have a child that's just learning to do this and you're the home visitor and they've tried it several times and the family member says, oh, you just have to see this, but you're the stranger and the child doesn't do it. So you might see more of this stuff in a virtual home visit. Then engaging the child in face-to-face interaction. Move your face up and down and wait for the child's response. So these are a bunch of curriculum ideas that I just pulled out of the level 1 curriculum. And I would just tell you, just start looking through it and seeing all the great ideas. There's also some, I can't remember what we call it, but it's like things to think about, you know, like when a child is first starting to like use a cup or something like that. So make sure the temperature is appropriate and they're not going to like pour it all over everything and stuff like that. So there are some cautions about anything that you're doing or things that you would need to have cautions about. This is a slide that I know Jennifer used this last week, but we wanted to repeat this so that people understand that Zoom isn't the only thing that you can use, or GoToMeetings isn't. There's lots of different things. And using Seesaw, I know a lot of the professionals in my community are using Seesaw, and you can just embed the child's current goals and ask the parents to record the child and then post it for you. The core Seesaw is free, and you can purchase more paid versions of it. But then there's also, for virtual data collection, any kind of video conferencing is really helpful. And I just have Zoom, FaceTime. Some of the districts in my state use Google Classroom, and using those, you can conduct activities with, let's just keep it with individual children, and score some of the assessment information based on your observations. You can be really intentional about the activities that you would like to see family members use with their child, so that you can make sure that you're able to collect assessment data. And you can record Zoom sessions and then go back and score items. And I've been doing that a little bit too. The one thing that I wanted to say about like all of these things before I move into closure of this is that all of these suggestions that I've been making today are ways to keep families and their children kind of engaged in doing something, so that trying to get them to practice or perform a skill doesn't just become direct instruction, where that's the only thing that they work on. And we know that children are much more engaged and involved when practicing a skill is just part of what they're doing with their family member or their sibling or something like that. And we know that's how most of us learned how to do things too. We probably didn't have a whole lot of direct instruction given to any of us. So I just want to remind you that we know that kids do better when it's like an activity or a routine that they're engaged in, rather than just practicing a skill over and over. And I don't think I've said that to anybody for a very long time, but I think the AEPS just really removes a lot of that like repetitive practice. Okay, so this is pretty much the end of this webinar. In conclusion, I would really like to encourage you to know your tool and all of its components. There are so many resources that can help you virtually. And if you just review the AEPS, review these slides and your notes to identify ideas that are going to work in your current context. And I would also say send or share AEPS materials that families can use, but don't overwhelm them. I know that when I get things sent to me that I'm supposed to like review or edit or something like that, I really kind of like to do things in piecemeal. And so families can get very overwhelmed with things. And a lot of these things, you can probably send them a couple of different ideas of things to do that you can then fold back into your collection of assessment or data collection. And then learn from each experience to improve, you know, how our work with families during this very odd time can continue to progress. So we want to continue to improve our work with families. I myself can tell you that since the end of March, when I started doing all this virtual interacting and meeting time, I really have learned a lot. I still haven't learned how to put a nice background behind me, but I've learned how to, in an otherwise asynchronous class, I've learned how to have a meeting with myself and record me talking to them, so that it isn't just blah, 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 reading things. So every experience hopefully can help us all during this really odd time. And then please continue to encourage families to do the best that they can. Amy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. That was really great. So if anyone has any questions, you can type them into the question box right now. I just want to go over a few quick slides. We have 3 more AEPS webinars in our series. The next one's focused on developing goals, so I encourage you to sign up for the other webinars. Brooks is also hosting some free coffee chats on various topics, including several on early childhood. So I put the URL in the chat box. Dr. Johnson, if you just go one more slide forward for me.
Sure.
So the URL is up there as well, so you could jot that down. Or if you're listening, pause the recording. We also have compiled many resources related to providing services during the COVID-19 time period. You can just move one slide for me. And there's links to lots of resources from the ECTA Center and 0 to 3. So I encourage you to check out those resources as well. And that URL is in your chat box. And then just one more reminder for those of you who are joining us live, please complete the survey. We'd love to have your feedback. And then one more slide is the URL. For everyone who is watching the recording, the URL to get your certificate is on the screen now. So you can go ahead and pause it and jot down that URL. For those of you who are listening live, it's in the handout section, and you'll get a link tomorrow in your follow-up email. Or of course, you could jot this down as well. Okay, so now we'll start taking some questions. Let me go to our question box. Let's see. So we had some questions during the webinar about the various assessment activities. So volume 2, the test in the back, I think it's Appendix A, is where there are assessment activities in the back of that volume. There are also different assessment activities that are in AEPSi. So if you're an AEPSi user, Monica, please correct me, but I think it's in the My Groups section, and you must be in the provider role to access the activities that are in AEPSi. And then we're also making, during the pandemic, a special release available of all of those AEPSi activities in fillable PDFs. So if you're not an AEPSi user, or if you are an AEPSi user and just want a fillable form to use with families. So I hope that clears up the many assessment activities that are available. There's 3 types right now.
And make your own from just looking at some of those.
Right, yes. So the slide handouts will be in there's a link in if you scroll up in the chat box, the slide handout link is there. There also will be in the follow-up email tomorrow. There will also be a link to a recording in your follow-up email tomorrow and your certificate. And you're welcome to share that link to the recording with other colleagues. And the survey is gonna pop up as soon as you exit the webinar, the survey will pop up. You can take it then, or in your follow-up email tomorrow, there'll be an embedded link that you could take it tomorrow or at a later time if you want it. Okay. Let's see. So do we have any questions about engaging families? Give it just a minute. We have a question about this. Is it the Seesaw Parent and Family app? I think so. We Google, if you Google Seesaw, it'll come up on the page ahead. If you look at your handouts, you'll see the icon for Seesaw. I did not actually download that app onto my phone. I went to like the browser and did it.
Yeah, I did too.
And they did have a free version that you could use to work with your families. Let's see. Okay. We have a question here. If you're able to share samples of the curriculum volumes, yes, I'll follow up with a link to some samples, some materials from the curriculum volumes. I can do that. Okay. I'll give it one little bit longer. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Johnson, for presenting. We're happy to have you with us today. Oh, I think you might be muted.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you, everyone, for being here.
Yes, and please join us for future webinars. Dr. Johnson will be presenting, I think it's October 1st, a webinar on early intervention services. The next webinar next week is on developing goals. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.